Well, good morning, friends. I am Pastor Michelle here at Harmony Creek Church, and I wanted to bring you my sermon today. Today's Sunday, August 23rd. And so my sermon this morning is all about the cross. This is one of the many questions that were asked during the Ask the Pastor Sunday back in April. And essentially the question was centered around, why did Jesus have to die? And so I'm going to just give you my interpretation and my beliefs around this question, and talk about what the cross has become. So the cross, it's become a major symbol for Christianity. You know, we see crosses everywhere. We see them. We wear the crosses around our necks. We wear them on our shirts. I bought this shirt specifically for today. We put crosses up at our houses. We put them up in our sanctuaries, on our steeples. We tattoo crosses on ourselves. And as I said, we get bumper stickers for our cars. I even have a cross that's hanging in my car on my rear view mirror, or not rear view mirror, hanging up on the mirror, anyway. I have a cross in my car. And you know, there's nothing wrong with having these crosses, because for us who claim to follow Jesus, for us who claim to be Christians, right, who call ourselves Christians, the cross is a symbol of hope. It's a symbol that tells us that God's story is continuing on. It's a symbol that we remember that the cross is empty and that Jesus rose again. You know, Jesus' story didn't end on the cross. Jesus' story didn't even end after the resurrection and after he ascended back up into heaven, right? We know that Jesus, after his resurrection, he was on the earth for a while, visiting with his friends after being risen from the dead. And then he ascended back up. And before ascending, he gave instructions to all his followers, right? And he said, let us make disciples of all nations. That's the instructions he gave to us as his followers. So Jesus' story actually continues on today through all of us. This gospel, the gospel, the story about God's love for all. It's something that is still very much being written. This is a story very much being written still. God is still very much speaking through all of us. That's the UCC catchphrase, right? God is still speaking. There's another catchphrase that the UCC had too, that was, God's story didn't end with a period. It ended with a comma. So yes, you know, going back to the cross, you know, what the cross means to us now, right, is hope and love and knowing that the cross is empty, right? But that's not what the cross was seen to, how the cross was probably seen to Jesus or anyone during Jesus's time. You know, I want to point out something liberation theologian James Cone said about the cross. And he offers a real critique and just gives us a different understanding of the cross in his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, which I'll talk about more in a minute. But Cone just says, we have made the cross so familiar that sometimes we have forgotten how horrifying it was. We wear it around our necks. We put it in our cars. We hang it in our sanctuaries. The cross can become a harmless, non-offensive ornament, a symbol that costs us nothing. End quote. So perhaps there is that notion that perhaps the more we wear it, the more we see it as a mere decoration. It becomes kind of a harmless ornament. But the cross was anything but harmless. The cross costs people something. And it cost Jesus his life. You know, Jesus, thinking about the cross and what the cross meant back then, Jesus lived during the time when Jerusalem was under Roman occupation. And during that time, crosses were not jewelry. They were not inspirational wall art. The cross was a warning. It was Rome's way of saying, you know what? This is what happens when you get out of line. Crucifixion, death by cross, was a humiliating, public, and brutal form of death. It was designed to terrify anyone who witnessed it. It was designed in a way to keep people in line. Because if you witness someone being crucified, then you're not going to step out of line with Rome. And Rome chose crucifixion, as I said, for people who stepped out of line. And Jesus was someone who stepped out of line. Jesus had this habit of upsetting the systems that kept the Roman Empire functioning. He was someone that dared to challenge the powers that be, and he ticked off a lot of people. And this is what I think led him to the cross. You know, Jesus' death emerged from a complicated collision of religious authority, political power, imperial control, and ultimately fear. And I think it's important to kind of point out, because we don't really see, I didn't choose the whole passage from Mark where we really live out Jesus's last moments on earth. I just chose when he actually died, that passage from Mark. But earlier in Mark, you know, Jesus, we see kind of what led Jesus to the cross, to the hill Golgotha. You know, Jesus was someone who challenged religious leadership. He challenged the social hierarchies that existed. He ate with sinners. He brought people in that had been cast aside. He saw the invisible. He touched the unclean. He loved those whom the world had deemed unlovable. He proclaimed a different kind of kingdom. He entered Jerusalem publicly and disrupted the temple system. He turned over tables. And essentially, and we could go on and on with what Jesus did that was probably seen as a threat, but he became a problem that those in power, he became such a problem that those in power wanted Jesus removed. So a little more background about the hours that led up to Jesus' death on the cross. So Jesus is accused by the Sanhedrin of blasphemy. And the Sanhedrin were the Jewish high court at the time. They were almost like the Supreme Court. But keep in mind that the Sanhedrin were also people that had to keep in line with the Roman authorities. Their power rested almost solely on keeping the peace. So Jesus goes before the high priest Caiaphas. And the high priest eventually hands Jesus over to Pontius Pilate. And Pilate, wanting to make the crowds happy during Passover, hands Jesus over to be crucified instead of the criminal Barabbas. Jesus is put on the cross, and Roman soldiers mock him by putting on his head a crown of thorns. And we see all this going on in the Gospel of Mark. So one question that many of us focus on, and then in Mark, we see that Jesus takes his last breath. The world goes dark. The temple is torn in two. There's so much going on in that short passage from Mark. But essentially what we see is Jesus taking his last breath, Jesus crying out to God in these Aramaic words. It is a very dark scene in many ways. And we read that, and one of the things we focus on a lot, I think, is why did Jesus die? You know, that brings us back to that question. Why did Jesus die? Well, one of Christianity's most influential explanations of Jesus' death on the cross is what many theologians, and what it has been called substitutionary atonement theory. Now, theologian Anselm and others, but Anselm was one that was pretty well known for helping to develop the idea around this atonement theory. Basically, the idea is that humanity's sin created a debt or punishment that needed to be satisfied. And Jesus took that punishment upon himself so that we could be forgiven. This understanding of the cross is still very prevalent in many Christian churches today. And how many of you have heard this view of Jesus' death, why Jesus died? Because I remember being told this way, because it was always like there was a chasm separating us from God. And the cross served as the bridge to help us get over to God. But the more I think about it, and the more I lean into my progressive and inclusive ways and my liberal ways and progressive ways of understanding the Bible, progressive ways of understanding Jesus. I don't think this is the best way to understand Jesus' death. I believe Jesus died because he lived in a way that confronted a world that was organized around power, violence, exclusion, and fear. And I don't believe Jesus died because God needed someone to punish. Jesus died because of the way he lived and the way he loved, and because of the way that he did challenge those in power. Those in power don't like when people are trying to disrupt their power or take apart the systems that are giving them the power in the first place. They feel threatened. So I wonder, instead of even asking why did God die, why did God need Jesus to die, or why did Jesus die? Maybe the better question, I think, is what does Jesus' death reveal about us? What does the cross reveal about us? It's a different kind of question, I think. I like to think the cross reveals what humans do when confronted with someone who refuses to participate in the broken systems that we have built. It reveals what happens when someone says there's another way. The powers might reply to that, not if we can stop it. There's not another way, right? In one of his books, James Cone, who I quoted earlier, in The Cross and the Lynching Tree, he talks about how the cross and the lynching tree interpret each other. They kind of compares the cross and lynching tree, because both were spectacles of violence against people regarded as threats or outsiders. And Cone essentially is saying that we can't fully understand the cross without looking at the history of Black people who were terrorized, humiliated, and murdered on the lynching tree. He says that the cross gives theological language to help us better understand what the lynching tree meant. He says the lynching tree is the window that best reveals the religious meaning of the cross in our land, end quote. And he's basically saying that if we want to understand what the cross means in America, look at the lynching tree. James Cone's comparison is uncomfortable for us as Americans because our country knew what it meant to use public death to send a message. The lynching tree was not simply about killing one person, it was about terrorizing an entire community. It was a message from the powers that be that said, this is what happens when you step outside the boundaries that we have created for you. It is a powerful comparison, the cross and the lynching tree. These ideas of public deaths, which in Romans and in the time of Jesus, the cross, execution, the crucifixion was a very public death. Just like the lynching tree. Lynching tree was a very public death. In a more, I know that this was not a lynching tree, but there was something called a hanging wall in the TV show Handmaid's Tale, The Handmaid's Tale. I think it was The Handmaid's Tale, or it may have been there was another show that was made after The Handmaid's Tale that was supposed to be like the spinoff to it. But in the story of The Handmaid's Tale, in the storyline, they have something called the hanging wall. And essentially anyone that stepped out of line, their bodies would be hung on this hanging wall, and they would remain up there for a while. And people, in order to get to where they need to go, people always had to pass by the hanging wall. And they had to pass by these bodies that were hung one by one for doing God knows what. What a sad, and it's hard to see that. But we compare that to these public forms of death, these ways of trying to send a message and trying to remind us to stay in line, right? In the lynching trees, that Cone does a really good job, I think. What a comparison, using the cross and the lynching tree. I've not actually finished the book yet, but I want to. We think about the lynching tree in those times, and years later, right, Martin Luther King Jr. comes onto the scene. And he was also someone like Jesus. I mean, he was inspired by Jesus. He was inspired by Gandhi's nonviolence approach as well. But Martin Luther King Jr. was someone who dared to challenge the powers that be. And he was someone who was killed. He dared to challenge a nation that claimed to believe in freedom while denying freedom to millions of people. Anyone that wasn't part of the in crowd, so to speak. You know, when they killed Martin Luther King Jr., yes, they killed the messenger, but they couldn't kill the message. The same could be said for Jesus. They killed Jesus, but they couldn't kill the message that Jesus was proclaiming. And yes, they also couldn't get rid of Jesus because, as we see in our second reading from Mark, Jesus was resurrected 3 days after his crucifixion. That's probably one of the most important parts of his story. But yes, that Jesus resurrected. But thinking about like Martin Luther King Jr., like his dreams didn't die when he did. The civil rights movement didn't end on April 4th, 1968. The struggle for racial justice didn't end. And the work of making this country a place where there is freedom and justice for all, my goodness, that's work that is continuing on today. We still live in a world where people are treated as threats simply because of who they are or who they love or how they self-identify or where they come from or just what those in power imagine that they represent. And we may not be seeing people hung on trees, lynching trees. We may not be seeing people hung on a cross. We may not be seeing people hung on a hanging wall. But we are seeing bad things happen to innocent lives. We are seeing, especially with the way the immigrants are being treated in our country right now with ICE, we see people continuing to be detained, families being separated from one another, people being deported. We see human beings being reduced to labels such as illegal, as though a person's legal status somehow determines their worth. When we know the only thing that determines our worth is the fact that we are God's beloved as we are. There's nothing else outside of that that can tell us who we are. We are worthy from the get-go. From the moment we enter this world to the moment we leave this world, we are worthy. We are God's beloved just as we are. And I just wonder, there's just so much when we look at the news and see everything that's happening. Not only with ICE, but we see it with the wars that are happening. My goodness. What do we do in light of everything? Well, how do we know what to do to make a difference? And this kind of leads into, it's a good segue into my sermon that I'll preach next month. But about how do we determine what's ours to do? Because there's so much work and we can get overwhelmed by how much there seems to be to do. But what do we do in light of everything? And I think we can take a page from Paul, from Philippians 2, which was our call to worship. And Paul is essentially telling us to have the same mind, let the same mind be in you that was in Jesus. And what was Jesus's mind? Jesus didn't cling to power, but he emptied himself for his mission, for what he was about. Jesus loved in a self-giving way. Jesus saw the people the world overlooked and moved toward them rather than away from them. Jesus spoke truth to power. Having the same mindset of Jesus means that we don't simply, I think, look at the cross and remember what Jesus did. Maybe we look at the cross and remember what we can do now. How will we live differently because of the cross? Maybe that's the question for us today to ponder. Amen.